So now we start to look at ways that we can enhance motor skill acquisition and learning. Again, part of the whole psychological component to kind of learning, whether it's sports skills or again just general motor skills, is kind of breaking things down for individuals so that they can see them. Because we all, anytime we've learned a new skill, we notice that we have difficulty at first, but there's different ways to kind of enhance this. One way is looking at whole versus part practice. So whole versus part practice basically breaks down this way. Whole practice basically addresses a skill in its entirety. So basically it looks at a skill, whatever it may be, look at a sports skill, just look at a general movement pattern in life and just kind of looks at the entire thing. Part practice kind of separates it. And what that tends to do is a lot of times tends to make learning a drill or a skill much easier. So it separates it into subcomponents, and there's different ways that you can look at this. One is through segmentation. This breaks the task into subcomponents that have clear breaks between each segment, so it really kind of breaks down the subcomponents where there's like a clear delineation between different parts of it. Fractionalization breaks the task into subcomponents that happen simultaneously. So it looks at subcomponents but that have a much smoother transition. And then simplification adjusts the difficulty of the task by changing the characteristics, such as either the execution of speed or the equipment used. So maybe what you do is, in the case of maybe a skill that happens a little bit faster, you slow it down a little bit. So you're actually just adjusting the difficulty of it. And again, you can look at your textbook for examples as to how some of these things take place. But, in the end, these are different ways that we can kind of teach skills. And again, regardless kind of what your specialty area is, certainly for everybody involved in the class, there's techniques from this you can use, whether you're, again, athletic training, physical therapy, occupational therapy, strength and conditioning, exercise physiology. When you're going to be working with individuals and teaching them new movement skills, these are certainly different ways, different techniques that you can utilize. So other ways we look at the whole concept of whole versus part practice. Pure part training has each athlete practice each subcomponent of skills multiple times independently. So that just looks at, you're literally just taking subcomponents of a skill and you're just training them multiple times. And again, whether you're looking at working with athletes per se or not, again, just replace athlete with whatever it is you would be dealing with. So you're basically just looking at taking each subcomponent of a skill and just practicing it over and over and over again. Progressive part training has an individual practice two parts in isolation before practicing them together. And then a third component can eventually be practiced, and then you put all three together. So what you do is you kind of now start to kind of link some different components together. You still kind of practice them in isolation, then you practice them together, and then you kind of just build upon it. And then repetitive part training has an athlete practice only the first part in isolation, and then each subsequent part is added until the whole task is integrated. So what you're basically seeing here are just three different ways to kind of look at part training. And again, it can be either a progression between them all, or you could look at kind of ways to sort of link things together. So, again, a lot of this is going to kind of depend on, the aptitude of the individual that you're dealing with. And again, just kind of understanding that people do learn things differently. So it's kind of going to be important when you're kind of practically applying this information for individuals that you're dealing with. So then you have to look at kind of how you're going to organize the overall practice, if you will. So you look at the practice schedules. There's different ways you can do this. There's random practice. So basically you can have an individual perform multiple skills kind of in random order. Okay, so in other words, you don't really have any particular sequence as to how you want to do things. You're just going to have them practice various skills. You can do variable practice, which includes variations of the same skill within a single practice. So maybe you just take one skill and you just include different variations of it. And then you have observational learning. So this is a situation where now you're not having the individual actually perform things, but you're having them watch things. You're having them watch videos or demonstrations as to how something is done. And again, this could be very important for say visual learners to be able to see things getting done, and then they could kind of translate it into their actual performance. So what we looked at prior to was just looking at individual ways to kind of teach a skill. Here we're looking at ways to kind of organize the actual practice of the skill. So this is the two different concepts to look at as far as organizing skill acquisition. And probably one of the most important things from the standpoint of where we're all coming from is giving good instructions. And sometimes we think that just because we're there telling somebody how to do something that they're going to necessarily just be able to carry it right out. And this becomes, even I would say much more of an art than a science, but there's definitely different ways you can do this. There's explicit instructions, so this includes basically prescriptive information that instructs the individual about rules, how to effectively execute a given task. So you're given basically just specific instructions. Guided discovery provides the individual with instructions about the overall movement or goal and what you're trying to do or your task accomplishment, but without giving explicit instructions. So this guided discovery, the difference between the two of these is explicit instructions gives them specific information about each individual task or how they're to do it. Guided discovery focuses more on goals. So it focuses more on the goal of the task, not necessarily a direction. So what you're kind of given here is what it is you want to accomplish, but you're not necessarily given the specific steps in order to do it, okay? Again, this is a situation where it depends kind of on the learning style of the individual and how well it also depends on, I would even say, the instructional style of the person who's in charge of helping somebody. So when you're doing this, you need to make sure, and again, there's pluses and minuses to each one of these, that, and I even think that to a degree, sometimes using a combination of the two could be beneficial. So again, two different ways of providing instructions and ways to kind of allow the individuals to see how to accomplish their tasks. Now, another important learning thing is feedback. So you have different types of feedback. So intrinsic feedback is provided by the athletes or individual from their senses. So for instance, sensory information, the example here is sensory information from missing a box jump or missing a box during the squat box jump. So if they go to jump up onto a box and they miss it, they have explicit sensory information telling them maybe what they did wrong, maybe what they need to work on, things of that nature, okay? They get specific intrinsic feedback from that. Augmented feedback comes from an observer, okay? And again, whether that's a coach, they're able to see it on a video. There's laboratory equipment when you're looking at biomechanics and movement that could study these things. These are all things, and feedback is really important. Intrinsic feedback is going to be more beneficial to an individual who has kind of good sensory perception, meaning that they kind of have really good body awareness. They could usually tell. And maybe an individual who's not as keen to that, they may need more augmented feedback. Now, the augmented feedback, again, this kind of takes on more of an art than a science, meaning that you have to watch how much feedback you give to an individual. You have to be very strategic about it. So, when someone's learning a new skill, to kind of throw too much at them could sometimes overwhelm them, kind of get them thinking too much. So augmented feedback definitely is an acquired skill that individuals need to have in order to kind of help. And sometimes the augmented feedback, if you do it the right way, can kind of help with the intrinsic feedback. You could kind of make individuals more aware of their movements by pointing out maybe key things that they're doing right or wrong as they're learning some new skill. So it's important to note a couple things about feedback, okay? So obviously when you're initially learning a skill, you're going to need, an individual is going to need more feedback. However, again, it has to be somewhat, it has to facilitate them. So, again, sometimes, breaking down skills a little bit more and looking at individual components can kind of help with that. So feedback can be used to both facilitate learning and performance. So again, timing and frequency of feedback, has different influences on it. So knowledge of results is a form of augmented feedback that provides an athlete with information about execution of the task goal. So again, if they kind of know what their results are, they have kind of already augmented feedback that kind of tells them about how well maybe they executed something. So maybe if the results aren't what they necessarily expected, they can then kind of look back at and kind of self-evaluate maybe what they need to work on. Knowledge of performance is a form of augmented feedback that provides the athlete with information about his or her movement pattern. So again, they could kind of then see, and this is where sometimes video analysis, lab equipment could sometimes come in, because they can see themselves doing something, okay? Sometimes augmented feedback just from somebody telling them something, they can't conceptualize it, or maybe they just don't think that the person's giving them the right feedback. But a lot of times, if they could see themselves doing something, that many times has a much more profound effect, okay? Again, as we talked about, timing and frequency is important with feedback. So while concurrent feedback is beneficial for competition, and by concurrent meaning that, you're telling them things as it's happening, delayed feedback that's initially frequent and decreases with time sometimes facilitates learning more complex movement patterns. In other words, if you're constantly given concurrent feedback when they're learning stuff outside of, again, direct competition. I mean, obviously during competition, individuals need to know in real time what's going on, but when they're just kind of learning things, sometimes the concurrent could actually impair learning. So the delayed aspect of it through some of these other means can sometimes actually help with the learning process, whereas a lot of times a lot of concurrent or real time while someone's learning a very difficult skill could sometimes actually impair learning. And these are your learning outcomes. That kind of concludes the chapter on measuring psychological factors,